So now we're going to talk about the study design that was used by the researchers for this particular study. And so I thought I would draw it out as a figure. Eric Rim described overall the health professionals follow-up study when he talked about a cohort study design. And it was this cohort study in which the researchers undertook their nested case control study to look at selenium levels and risk of advanced prostate cancer. So if you remember, the health professionals follow-up study started in 1986 when just over 50,000 men were invited to fill out a questionnaire. And all of these men initially were free of cancer, including prostate cancer. So we had 50,000 men who started the study. Then, a year later, one of the investigators thought it would be very interesting to collect toenails. And the reason is that toenails can be a source of different biomarkers to study. And if you think about a nail, it takes an entire year almost for the nail to grow from this beginning part to the end. And so by taking a clipping, you're collecting, you can study levels of different biological factors that reflect what happened in the previous year. And so, they weren't able to get toenail specimens from all 50,000 men, but they were able to get toenails from just over 37,000 of the men in the health professionals follow-up study. So this is our source population for our nested case control study. Now, so this was now 1987, and then Ed Giovannucci, who's the last author on this study, didn't have the hypothesis back in 1997. He had the hypothesis after he saw the Larry Clark study. So the Larry Clark study that I referred to, that randomized trial, that was published in 1996. So now here's Ed in 1996 with his study hypothesis. And so he went back into this collection of toenails that were stored, and he wanted to measure selenium in the toenails. Now he had limited funds available to do this study. So therefore, he wasn't able to measure selenium levels on all 37,000 men. So instead, he undertook a nested case control study. So here's Ed in 1996. I believe they ended follow-up for this study in 1994. So basically what they did was they took all of the advanced prostate cancer cases that occurred between 1987 and 1994. So they had all of the advanced prostate cancer cases. And then they undertook risk set sampling in order to select the controls for this study. And so if you remember, the risk set means that they identified, say, case number 1 in 1988, and then they looked at all of the men that were still at risk of developing prostate cancer at that time and selected one control. And so they did a nested case control study using risk set sampling, and they nested it within these 37,000 men in the health professionals follow-up study who had given a toenail specimen. So what did the researchers find? Well, here I compare the results from the epidemiological study to what they found in the Larry Clark randomized trial among men with non-melanoma skin cancer. So the source population for the study in the health professionals was the 33,000 men with toenails. They measured selenium levels in the toenails, and then they had 7 years of follow-up for the cases. So during 7 years of follow-up, they had a number of men develop advanced prostate cancer. Then they had the controls, and they were able to calculate odds ratios as a measure of the relative risk. And what they found was that the men who had the highest levels of selenium in their toenails had about a 60% lower risk of developing advanced prostate cancer compared to men who had the lowest levels. And that relative risk estimate was very much in line with the results from the randomized trial. So now, after you've had a chance to read through this paper and in more detail, I'd like to talk with you about some questions that come up in thinking about and critiquing this study. So the first question is, why do you think the authors conducted a nested case control study instead of a cohort study among the 33,000 cohort members? That's one question. Okay, the second question I'd like you to address is this, and it's a little bit complex, but it gets at the principles of risk set sampling. So in this design, researchers identified a case of advanced prostate cancer, and then for each case, they sampled one control from the source population who is at risk. That's the definition of risk set sampling. So the question I have for you to think about and to discuss is, if participant 1 was diagnosed with advanced prostate cancer in 1990, and participant 2 also was diagnosed with prostate cancer, but he wasn't diagnosed until 1993. The question that I want you to think about is, should we exclude participant 2 from the risk set of being a potential control for participant number 1? So I want you to think about that question, and also to say why or why not should we exclude this person from being a potential control for that case who was diagnosed in 1990. That's our second question. The third question that I want you to think about relates to the measurement of selenium, which is our exposure in this study. So I want you to think about three things. When we think about an exposure, oftentimes, very simply, we can categorize it as yes or no. But oftentimes, the exposure is much more complicated. In this case, we have not a yes-no question, but it's a continuous measure. And for this study, they've divided it into 5 equal groups, or quintiles. But I also want you to think, what is the window of exposure for selenium levels? And what I mean by that is, does this selenium measurement reflect something that happened 20 years ago? Does it reflect something more recently? And how might that influence your interpretation of the study findings? Secondly, I want you to think about, what are some potential limitations or biases around the measurement of this exposure? And so I want you to think about the core concepts of epidemiology and how they relate to measurement of the exposure. And then finally, if you are concerned about bias, how would this bias might influence the relative risk estimate? And if so, if you think it's going to influence it, how great do you think the potential bias is? So that's the third question. The final question relates to a subsequent study that was undertaken in the US, and I want you to compare and contrast. So we have the Larry Clark study, the randomized study, that was published in 1996, that found as a secondary analysis that men randomized to selenium had about a 60% lower risk of prostate cancer compared to men randomized to placebo. Then we had the epidemiological study. There were actually several studies undertaken looking at either biomarkers of selenium, either in toenails or in blood, and many of them found an inverse association between selenium levels and risk of prostate cancer, and in particular risk of advanced prostate cancer. About 8 years ago, the National Cancer Institute in the US undertook a study known as the SELECT trial. And this SELECT trial was undertaken specifically based on all of the epidemiological data that had been conducted on selenium and prostate cancer, and thinking about selenium as a potential chemopreventive agent for prostate cancer, so whether it could be used for primary prevention. And so they recruited 35,000 men from the United States. They were all healthy, so none of them had cancer at the time of diagnosis. They were randomized in what's called a 2x2 factorial design. So they either received selenium together with vitamin E, selenium alone, vitamin E alone, or placebo. And on average, when the study was published, the follow-up on average for this study was 5 years. Now, in contrast to many of the epidemiological studies, as well as the results from Larry Clark, this study found that there was no association between randomization to selenium and the risk of prostate cancer. So the relative risk was 1.04. So they found no evidence of a protective effect of selenium supplementation and as in prevention of prostate cancer. So I guess the question that I want you to think about is why? What are the advantages and disadvantages of a randomized controlled trial to ask this question compared to an epidemiological study? Are you concerned about what are the plausible explanations? And I want you to think about confounding, bias, as well as the interpretation of both the exposure and outcomes in the randomized control study in comparison to the epidemiological study. And so that's the final study critique question. And I'll look forward to see the answers that you post, and I will be logging on and providing comments on your thoughts on these critique questions. Thank you very much for letting me be a part of this course.